By early 1945, the military position of Nazi Germany had deteriorated beyond recovery. Operational summaries from both the Western Allied and Soviet commands show that by January, Germany faced sustained offensives on multiple fronts, with its remaining industrial capacity impaired by continuous air attacks. The German Ardennes Offensive, launched in December 1944, failed to reverse German losses. After repelling that operation, the U.S. and British-led forces resumed a broad advance into Western Germany, supported by steady supplies and air superiority documented in the records of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army initiated the Vistula-Oder Offensive on January 12, 1945. Soviet General Staff reports record rapid advances across Polish and German-held territories, destroying major German formations and reaching the Oder River by early February. In the following weeks, German defenses fragmented further. Population flight, communication breakdown, and shortages of fuel and ammunition, noted in German high command documentation, reduced the capacity for coordinated resistance. In March 1945, U.S. forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, enabling the first major Allied crossing of the Rhine. This event, logged in after-action reports, expedited the movement of large formations into the German heartland. British forces crossed the Rhine shortly afterward in coordinated operations. By April, Western Allied units were advancing north, central, and south into Germany, while French troops moved through the southwest. Simultaneously, Soviet forces began the Battle of Berlin on April 16, 1945, a campaign detailed extensively in Soviet front headquarters logs. By the end of April, Berlin was encircled. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by suicide inside the Führer bunker in Berlin. Statements from surviving German officers and subsequent forensic examination verified his death. Admiral Karl Donitz assumed leadership, attempting to negotiate partial surrender terms to the Western Allies. But Allied requirements for unconditional surrender, publicly affirmed at Casablanca in 1943 and restated in diplomatic communications, left no possibility for a negotiated settlement. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. At Soviet insistence, a second signing took place on May 8, 1945, in Berlin. This date, recorded in Allied military correspondence, marked the end of the war in Europe. Immediately afterward, the four major Allied powers implemented their occupation plan. Germany ceased to exist as a sovereign state under the Declaration regarding the defeat of Germany, issued on June 5, 1945. This declaration vested supreme authority in the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, establishing a legal basis for the occupation and the future Allied Control Council. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, although geographically within the Soviet zone, was divided into 4 sectors under separate administrations. Minutes from early Allied Control Council meetings detailed disagreements concerning reparations, demilitarization policies, and the political future of the German territories. Despite the intention of joint governance, the differing administrative approaches soon produced friction. In the Soviet zone, occupation authorities supervised the dismantling and transfer of industrial equipment. Reports from the Soviet military administration in Germany and protests recorded by U.S. and British representatives verified the removal of machinery, metalworks, and industrial plants as part of reparations. Meanwhile, the war in Asia continued. Japanese forces, although numerous, suffered from shortages of fuel, raw materials, and industrial output. U.S. naval blockades and air operations reduced Japan's capacity to sustain prolonged conflict. Analyses by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey document that by mid-1945, Japanese aircraft production, steel production, and transportation infrastructure had sharply declined. The United States had prepared for a full invasion of Japan. Operation Downfall, according to military planning documents, was expected to involve high casualties. At the same time, the Manhattan Project reached operational capability after years of coordinated scientific and industrial work. The first atomic device was successfully tested on July 16, 1945 during the Trinity test, as confirmed by laboratory and military test reports. Japan did not initially accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Subsequently, the United States deployed atomic weapons. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was detonated over Hiroshima. On August 9, a second bomb was detonated over Nagasaki. These events are extensively documented in U.S. Air Force mission logs and Japanese municipal records. Japan accepted the surrender terms on August 15, 1945, and the formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945 aboard the USS Missouri. Japan entered a period of Allied occupation under U.S. administration led by General Douglas MacArthur. The basic initial post-surrender directive outlined demilitarization, constitutional restructuring, and economic reforms. In addition to Japan, former Japanese-held territories underwent new administrative arrangements. The Soviet Union occupied southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Korea, liberated from Japanese rule, was divided at the 38th parallel. This division originated in U.S. planning discussions in August 1945 and was formalized in September when the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to accept Japanese surrenders in their respective areas. Although intended as an administrative line, documented occupation correspondence shows it soon developed into a political boundary. Legal accountability for wartime actions became an early priority. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg began proceedings in November 1945, establishing legal frameworks for prosecuting crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In Asia, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tokyo Trials, commenced in 1946 AD, organized under Allied occupational authority and documented in tribunal records. These legal processes formalized the post-war effort to address wartime conduct. The United Nations Charter entered into force on October 24, 1945. Its creation followed the San Francisco Conference of April-June 1945, during which the participating nations drafted the charter establishing the General Assembly, Security Council, International Court of Justice, and related institutions. Early Security Council meetings documented disagreements between Western powers and the Soviet Union, particularly concerning disputes in Iran, Poland, and the Balkans. These disagreements illustrate that the wartime alliance no longer functioned as a unified political body. The economic and human cost of the war shaped early post-war policy decisions. Allied assessments documented heavy destruction across Europe. In Germany, More than 40% of the housing stock was destroyed or damaged. Berlin, Warsaw, Stalingrad, Hamburg, and numerous other cities suffered extensive losses. Transportation systems were disrupted, and agricultural output declined. Food shortages were common across Central and Eastern Europe. Human displacement reached unprecedented levels. Estimates from the Allied Displaced Persons Administration recorded more than 20 million displaced persons, including former forced laborers, prisoners of war, and civilians fleeing combat zones. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses. Demographic records indicate that approximately 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war. Industrial zones in Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia were heavily damaged. Soviet reconstruction efforts, reflected in government planning documents, prioritized restoring essential industries and rebuilding territories captured or destroyed during earlier phases of the war. Britain, though militarily victorious, faced severe economic difficulties. Cabinet papers and Treasury reports show shortages of hard currency reserves and reliance on U.S. financial support. The United Kingdom was unable to maintain pre-war levels of overseas military commitments while simultaneously funding domestic reconstruction. Beyond Europe, geopolitical conditions shifted as colonial authority weakened. In India, political developments were moving toward independence, achieved in 1947. In Southeast Asia, nationalist movements expanded in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, documented in colonial administration reports and declarations of independence. These conditions shaped the environment in which post-war powers would operate, introducing new actors and shifting strategic priorities. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union's refusal to withdraw forces from northern Iran at the end of the war, contrary to prior agreements, produced diplomatic protests from Britain and the United States in late 1945. The crisis, recorded in State Department and Foreign Office correspondence, marked one of the earliest documented disputes between the wartime allies. Additionally, the Soviet Union pressed for territorial and naval concessions from Turkey regarding control of the Turkish Straits, citing earlier agreements. Turkish diplomatic archives contain records of these exchanges. Such disputes indicate the broader geographic scope of post-war tensions. Even in Germany, where the Allies had initially envisioned coordinated administration, disagreements surfaced rapidly. Allied Control Council minutes from August and September 1945 document disputes over food distribution, transportation rights, and the extraction of reparations. Western Allied representatives objected to the Soviet removal of industrial equipment, while Soviet authorities argued these actions conformed to agreed-upon reparations measures. Early disagreements over access routes to Berlin also appear in these records, indicating that administrative friction began before formal Cold War crises emerged. By the end of 1945, the wartime coalition had dissolved into a grouping of powers with incompatible administrative methods, security concerns, and reconstruction strategies. The United States possessed unmatched industrial capacity and global military reach. The Soviet Union controlled vast territories in Eastern Europe and maintained one of the largest standing armies. Britain held significant influence, but lacked the economic resources to remain a primary global power. France began the process of reconstruction and reassertion, but was not yet positioned as a central shaper of the emerging order. No formal declaration marked the emergence of the Cold War in 1945. However, diplomatic correspondence, occupation directives, early UN debates, and administrative disputes across Germany, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia reveal a shift from wartime cooperation to structured rivalry. As governments prepared to implement agreements made earlier in the year at Yalta, the differences in interpretation and application of those agreements would soon define the next stage of international relations. The Yalta Conference, held from 4 to February 11, 1945, represented one of the final major meetings of the wartime allies before the end of the Second World War. The conference took place in the Levadia Palace in Crimea and brought together the leaders of the three principal Allied powers: Franklin D. Roosevelt for the United States, Winston Churchill for the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin for the Soviet Union. The purpose of the meeting, as documented in official correspondence and preparatory memoranda, was to finalize military coordination for the defeat of Germany and to outline the structure of the post-war international order. By the time the conference convened, the military situation had changed significantly from earlier Allied meetings. As documented in military communications at the time, Soviet forces were advancing deep into Eastern Europe, holding substantial control over Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, and parts of Eastern Germany. Western Allied forces were advancing through Belgium and France toward the German Rhineland. These battlefield conditions shaped the negotiations at Yalta because they determined which powers held practical administrative control over liberated territories. The conference began with discussions of the military situation. Reports from the combined chiefs of staff were presented, outlining the projected operations for the final defeat of Germany. According to minutes preserved in U.S. and British archives, all three leaders recognized that Germany's surrender was imminent, but the coordination of final offensives remained essential to avoid logistical complications and to speed the conclusion of hostilities. Soviet representatives confirmed their planned timeline for the offensive toward Berlin, while U.S. and British representatives reviewed operations on the Western Front. These military discussions, while straightforward, provided the foundation for the political negotiations that followed. A central subject at Yalta was the future of Poland. Official documents from the conference note that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin discussed the composition of a provisional Polish government, the redrawing of Poland's borders, and the promise of future elections. The leaders referenced earlier agreements, including the Tehran Conference of 1943, which had outlined general principles for post-war territorial arrangements. At Yalta, the parties agreed to reorganize the existing Lublin Committee into a broader provisional government that would include additional members from within Poland and abroad. This decision was recorded in the formal Declaration on Liberated Europe, issued during the conference. The declaration called for free elections and the establishment of democratic institutions, although no mechanism for enforcement was specified. The future implementation of this declaration would later become a major point of contention among the Allies. Germany's post-war administration was another critical topic. Discussions at Yalta built upon earlier decisions made at the European Advisory Commission. According to conference records, the leaders finalized the division of Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, Soviet, and French. Berlin would also be divided into 4 sectors. The leaders agreed on the need for coordinated administration through an Allied Control Council. Reparations were discussed in detail. The Soviet Union proposed a large total reparations figure, while U.S. and British representatives emphasized a combination of industrial dismantling and other forms of compensation. The conference did not finalize exact numerical targets, but it established a commission to develop a reparations plan. These arrangements, while formally cooperative, contained significant differences that would later become evident in the implementation phase. Another major topic at Yalta was the establishment of the United Nations. Preparations for the United Nations Charter had been underway since the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944. At Yalta, the leaders negotiated issues concerning membership in the General Assembly and the structure of the Security Council. One of the key agreements, documented in the conference minutes, concerned the veto power of the permanent members. It was agreed that the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, China, and eventually France would serve as permanent members and possess veto authority. These decisions were essential for completing the UN Charter, which would later enter into force on October 24, 1945. In addition to European matters, the leaders discussed post-war arrangements in Asia. In conference records, Roosevelt and Stalin negotiated the conditions under which the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would, within 3 months of Germany's surrender, declare war on Japan. In return, the Allies acknowledged Soviet interests in territories previously lost to Japan in earlier conflicts, including southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. These agreements, though not public at the time, were documented in the conference protocols and later confirmed in diplomatic communications and subsequent Soviet actions in August 1945. The leaders also reaffirmed their commitment to the unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. This policy, established at earlier wartime conferences and reflected in military planning documents, remained unchanged at Yalta. The discussions emphasized the need to prevent the re-emergence of German militarism, a position reflected in plans for demilitarization, denazification, and long-term disarmament. These objectives were incorporated into Allied Control Council directives later in 1945. Although the Yalta Conference produced formal agreements, the documented discussions revealed differences in interpretation regarding political processes in Eastern Europe. For example, the leaders agreed to the Declaration on Liberated Europe, which affirmed that liberated nations should be allowed to form governments of their own choosing. Yet the definition of free elections and the nature of political participation were not universally understood in the same manner by the participants. Conference records and subsequent communications between the Allied governments show that these ambiguities were not resolved at Yalta, leaving questions that would become central to post-war disagreements. The conference also addressed the issue of displaced persons and repatriation. Millions of civilians, prisoners of war, and forced laborers were scattered across the continent. Documentation from the Yalta meetings includes references to the need for coordinated repatriation efforts. The Allies agreed on procedures for the return of Soviet citizens and other nationals to their countries of origin. These repatriation policies were later implemented through occupation authorities and international relief organizations. Another topic involved the restructuring of the Balkan region. Although no major territorial decisions were made at Yalta concerning Yugoslavia or Greece, the conference records include references to ongoing political developments in both areas. The Allies acknowledged the complex post-war situation in the Balkans, but did not create new policies at the conference. Events in these regions would later influence Cold War dynamics, but at the time of Yalta, decisions were deferred. The leaders also discussed the administration of liberated Austria. They agreed to re-establish Austria as an independent state, separate from Germany, in accordance with earlier Allied statements. Austria would be divided into occupation zones similar to Germany, with Vienna divided into 4 sectors. These arrangements were recorded in the conference agreements and later implemented in 1945. As the conference concluded, the leaders issued a series of formal statements summarizing their agreements. These documents covered the future political structure of Poland, the creation of the United Nations voting structure, the plans for Germany's occupation and reparations, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, Soviet entry into the war against Japan, the re-establishment of Austria. These statements were later published or referenced in diplomatic exchanges, and they formed the basis for post-war policies implemented in the months following Germany's surrender. Although the conference ended with a public display of cooperation, official correspondence exchanged between the Allied governments after Yalta documented early divergence in the interpretation of certain agreements, particularly regarding Poland and Eastern Europe. Soviet and Western communications reflected different views concerning the structure of the Polish provisional government and the nature of elections. These differences, while still contained within the framework of wartime cooperation, signaled that the implementation of the Yalta agreements would not proceed smoothly. The conference also illustrated emerging differences in post-war priorities. While all 3 powers agreed on the necessity of defeating Germany and establishing a stable post-war order, official documents reveal varying levels of emphasis on security, reconstruction, and political systems. These differences were evident in proposals for Germany's future economic management, reparations, and political processes in liberated regions. As 1945 progressed, the agreements made at Yalta would be tested in practice. The real implementation period began after Germany's surrender in May. At that point, the Allied Control Council in Berlin attempted to govern Germany jointly, drawing authority from the Yalta framework. Its early minutes, however, indicate immediate disagreements regarding industry, finance, administrative appointments, and access rights. These administrative difficulties foreshadowed the larger diplomatic disagreements that would emerge later in the year at the Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference, held from July 17 to August 2, 1945, marked the first major Allied summit after the defeat of Germany and the last meeting of the wartime leadership. Unlike the Yalta Conference earlier in the year, the gathering at Potsdam occurred under new political and military circumstances. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945, and the leaders present represented governments undergoing significant transitions. Harry S. Truman attended as the new President of the United States following Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April. The United Kingdom's delegation changed mid-conference from Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden to Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin after the British general election. Joseph Stalin represented the Soviet Union, which now occupied large portions of Eastern and Central Europe. These changes, documented in official conference proceedings, shaped the tone and substance of the discussions. The conference convened in Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam, northwest of Berlin, within the Soviet occupation zone. Delegations brought detailed briefs prepared by their respective foreign ministries. The primary agenda items, recorded in the Potsdam Protocol, were the political and economic administration of post-war Germany, reparations, the future of Eastern Europe, the prosecution of war criminals, Territorial adjustments in Europe. The occupation and administration of Austria. The structure of the peace settlement process. The first major topic was Germany's post-war administration. While Yalta had set broad principles, Potsdam focused on practical implementation. The Allied Control Council, established in June 1945, had already begun issuing ordinances for demilitarization and administrative oversight. However, reports submitted to the conference indicated differing national approaches in each occupation zone. The United States emphasized economic stabilization, documented in its Handbook for Military Government in Germany, while the Soviet Union prioritized the dismantling of industrial equipment and the restructuring of political institutions. British officials presented their own assessments of food shortages and industrial capacity in their zone. These documented differences informed the Potsdam discussions. The conference formalized the 4Ds of Allied policy in Germany: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, and decentralization. These policy objectives were written into the Potsdam Protocol. The leaders agreed that Germany should be treated as a single economic unit, with coordinated decisions on industry, agriculture, transportation, and currency. However, minutes from discussions reveal immediate disagreement over how to implement unified economic administration. The Soviet delegation requested substantial reparations to compensate for wartime losses, while the U.S. and British delegations emphasized the need for Germany to remain economically viable to prevent humanitarian crises. A reparations agreement was reached, but left key details unresolved. According to the Potsdam Protocol, the Soviet Union would receive reparations from its own occupation zone and an additional 10 to 15% of industrial equipment from the Western zones, subject to conditions related to German exports. Western records show that U.S. and British representatives expressed concern about the scale of industrial removal and its effect on recovery. Soviet documentation shows that they viewed reparations as essential for reconstruction. Potsdam did not establish precise enforcement mechanisms for resource distribution, leaving the arrangement dependent on cooperation within the Allied Control Council. Territorial decisions were also addressed. Conference records document agreement that territories east of the Oder-Neisse line, comprising most of former East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, would be placed under Polish administrative control pending a final peace settlement. This territorial adjustment was noted explicitly as provisional, but the lack of further clarification produced administrative inconsistencies. The conference also confirmed the transfer of northern East Prussia, including Königsberg, to the Soviet Union. These decisions reshaped the political map of Central Europe. Another subject documented in the conference minutes was Austria. The leaders affirmed that Austria would be treated as a liberated state rather than a defeated enemy, consistent with the earlier declaration of 1943. However, they agreed to divide Austria into 4 occupation zones, with Vienna divided into sectors similar to Berlin. These arrangements were implemented immediately after the conference. The conference also addressed the prosecution of major war criminals. The leaders reaffirmed plans for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which began proceedings in November 1945. The legal framework for these prosecutions, including the definition of crimes and procedures for evidence, had been drafted earlier in consultations between the Allies. Potsdam confirmed the commitment to proceed under the agreed-upon legal standards. One of the most significant developments during the conference was the discussion concerning Japan. The United States had successfully tested an atomic device at the Trinity Test Site on July 16, 1945, just before the conference began. Truman received this information through secure military communications at Potsdam. While the Trinity test was not disclosed publicly, its existence influenced U.S. strategic planning. Conference records show that on July 26, 1945, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union did not sign the declaration because it was still formally at peace with Japan, but Stalin reaffirmed the Soviet commitment to enter the war once final preparations were complete. These preparations were confirmed in Soviet General Staff communications, and the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945. Asian territorial arrangements were also revisited at the conference. Although specific discussions of the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin had been addressed at Yalta, Potsdam restated expectations relating to post-war settlements in accordance with previously documented agreements. Potsdam also noted that Korea would eventually achieve independence, although no timeline was established. The division at the 38th parallel, first implemented in September 1945, occurred outside the conference, but as part of the broader administrative framework established earlier in the year. A significant portion of the conference addressed the broader peace settlement process. The leaders agreed to establish a council of foreign ministers to draft peace treaties for Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Finland, and later Germany. This council, formally established in September 1945, was tasked with preparing treaties to stabilize Europe. However, correspondence among foreign ministers following Potsdam reveals that disagreements quickly emerged regarding the scope and terms of these settlements. Political conditions in Eastern Europe were discussed extensively. Reports from the U.S. and British delegations noted the growing influence of communist parties in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland. The Soviet delegation cited wartime sacrifices and administrative authority in these territories. The conference reaffirmed the Yalta Declaration on Liberated Europe, but no new enforcement provisions were added. After the conference, diplomatic correspondence indicates that the Western powers believed their understandings of political pluralism were not being implemented uniformly across Eastern Europe. Another documented administrative issue at Potsdam involved displaced persons and population transfers. The conference accepted the ongoing transfers of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, but emphasized that such transfers should be conducted in an orderly and humane manner. This statement appears in the Potsdam Protocol and corresponds to population movements already underway as recorded by Allied relief agencies. Millions of German civilians had fled or been expelled from these regions during and after the war. The conference did not establish precise procedures, but acknowledged the scale of the demographic changes. Economic recovery was another major topic. Conference documents record discussions on coal production, transportation networks, agricultural shortages, and industrial reconstruction in Europe. The leaders recognized the need for substantial rebuilding, but their approaches differed. U.S. delegates emphasized food security and economic stabilization. Soviet delegates emphasized reparations and the restoration of Soviet industry. British delegates documented concerns over food imports and financial limitations. These differences were noted in the minutes, but not resolved at the conference. The issue of occupation costs also appeared in the records. Each occupying power was responsible for costs within its zone, and there were discussions about resource sharing and administrative responsibilities. Disagreements over these issues were reflected in Allied Control Council meetings shortly after Potsdam. Potsdam also addressed the demilitarization of Germany. The leaders agreed to the dissolution of all German armed forces and to the elimination of German industrial capacities that could support military production. This policy was consistent with earlier occupation directives. The conference also confirmed the dissolution of the Nazi Party and the removal of its members from public office. During the conference, leadership transitions occurred in the British delegation. The general election held in the United Kingdom on July 5, 1945 concluded during the Potsdam Conference, and the Labour Party under Clement Attlee replaced Churchill's government on July 26. This transition is documented in the conference records, and both delegations confirmed continuity of policy despite the change in leadership. Although the conference produced a formal protocol outlining agreements, the documented discussions indicate that differences among the Allies were becoming more pronounced. The presence of occupation zones, economic divergence, reparations disputes, and conflicting interpretations of political commitments in Eastern Europe limited the effectiveness of joint decision-making. Allied Control Council minutes from August 1945 onward show repeated inability to achieve consensus on key administrative decisions. The Potsdam Conference thus marks a turning point in the transition from wartime cooperation to post-war rivalry. While the leaders produced agreements on Germany's administration, reparations, territorial adjustments, and the prosecution of war criminals, the documented record shows increasing difficulty in translating these agreements into coordinated action. The absence of enforcement mechanisms for political commitments in Eastern Europe and differing economic goals fractured the unity of the wartime alliance. In the months following Potsdam, these disagreements escalated during the implementation of occupation policies in Germany and across Eastern Europe. Potsdam did not formally end cooperation, but the conference exposed structural divisions that would shape the next phase of international relations. As events moved into late 1945 and 1946, the friction documented in the Potsdam proceedings developed into open political disputes, beginning with public statements such as the Fulton Iron Curtain speech of March 1946. The development, testing, and use of atomic weapons in 1945 introduced a new strategic condition in international affairs. Until that year, global military power was measured primarily in terms of industrial capacity, manpower, and conventional firepower. The advent of atomic technology changed this structure immediately. Documented wartime research, government communications, and military reports show how the deployment of the first atomic weapons influenced the final phase of the Second World War and created the strategic environment in which the Cold War developed. The scientific work that led to the first operational nuclear device took place across several research and industrial facilities in the United States under the Manhattan Project. This program, directed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and coordinated through laboratories such as Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, is extensively documented in wartime correspondence, engineering reports, and laboratory logs. By early 1945, enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge were producing uranium-235, and the Hanford site was generating plutonium-239. These outputs were sufficient to support bomb assembly and testing. The Trinity test conducted on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico provided the first demonstrated detonation of an atomic device. The test was recorded scientifically through high-speed photography, blast gauges, seismographs, and radiation measurements. Military reports transmitted to President Harry S. Truman, who was attending the Potsdam Conference at the time, documented the successful detonation and projected the implications for wartime strategy. The test introduced a new factor into Allied planning. The United States now possessed a weapon capable of destroying a military or industrial target with a single strike. At the Potsdam Conference, 17 July 2, August 1945, the existence of the atomic test was discussed privately among U.S. officials. Conference records confirm that Truman informed British Prime Minister Winston Churchill about the successful detonation. There is no record that the Soviet delegation was informed directly during the conference, although Soviet intelligence assessments, later confirmed through declassified archival files, indicated that Soviet scientific observers had anticipated the development of such a weapon. However, documented diplomatic records show no discussion of atomic cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union at Potsdam. Japan, still engaged in the Pacific War, had not accepted the Potsdam Declaration issued on July 26, 1945. Japanese military communications recovered after the war indicate that the Japanese government was divided regarding surrender terms, particularly concerning the status of the emperor. U.S. military planners, operating under previously issued directives for Operation Downfall, continued to prepare for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was projected to involve significant casualties. The United States had assembled 2 operational atomic bombs at this time. Scientific assembly and arming procedures are documented in Manhattan Project technical logs and U.S. Army Air Force's mission briefings. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber deployed the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima. Observations recorded by the U.S. Air Forces and Japanese authorities documented the destruction of urban infrastructure, the immediate disruption of communications, and the structural collapse within the blast radius. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. Japanese government minutes and communications from the imperial household confirmed that these events were central to the internal deliberations that followed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the surrender terms. On September 2, 1945, the instrument of surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri. The use of atomic weapons thus coincided with the conclusion of the Second World War. The introduction of atomic technology immediately placed the United States in a position of strategic superiority. Government memoranda from late 1945 document discussions within the U.S. military establishment concerning the future use, production, and control of nuclear weapons. The existence of atomic weapons affected diplomatic conditions in several regions. In Europe, the Soviet Union had previously been negotiating with the United States and the United Kingdom from a position supported by its large territorial occupation and conventional military strength. After August 1945, U.S. diplomatic communications indicate increased confidence in negotiations concerning the enforcement of earlier agreements. While no explicit reference to atomic superiority appears in the public documents from Allied Control Council meetings, internal memoranda reveal that U.S. officials recognized the strategic significance of possessing a weapon that no other state had. The atomic bomb also influenced discussions related to the formation of the United Nations. In the months surrounding the UN Charter's entry into force on October 24, 1945, documented debates occurred regarding international regulation of nuclear technology. These discussions resulted in the establishment of early commissions on atomic energy within the United Nations, though no binding system of international control was established at the time. The Soviet Union initiated a formal atomic research and weapons development program in response to the new strategic environment. Archival materials from Soviet scientific institutes, later declassified, document that Soviet physicists had been studying nuclear fission since the late 1930s. After 1945, Soviet government directives increased resource allocation to nuclear research. The existence of this program itself is not speculative. It is documented in internal communications, funding records, and personnel assignments. The Soviet Union's objective during this period was not outlined publicly, but the documented reorganization of scientific and industrial institutes indicates a national effort to develop atomic capability. Several documented events between 1945 and 1946 illustrate how atomic weapons altered diplomatic interactions. One example occurred in relation to early disagreements over reparations and economic coordination in Germany. While the United States continued to participate in Allied Control Council meetings, disagreements regarding industrial dismantling and resource transfers intensified. U.S. and British records from these meetings show increasingly divergent administrative decisions. And while the atomic weapon is not cited as a negotiating tool, the broader strategic environment had shifted in favor of the United States. In the Middle East, documented disputes involving Soviet forces in northern Iran in late 1945 corresponded chronologically with the period in which atomic superiority existed. The United States and the United Kingdom issued diplomatic communications urging Soviet withdrawal according to earlier agreements. Although the nuclear factor was not mentioned openly in diplomatic correspondence, the strategic advantage enjoyed by the United States formed part of the international context. Atomic weapons also influenced the administration of Japan. During the occupation, U.S. directives emphasized demilitarization, disarmament, constitutional reform, and economic restructuring. Japanese government records and occupation directives show substantial institutional reorganization, including the dissolution of the Japanese armed forces and revisions to the constitution implemented in 1947. The occupation proceeded under conditions in which the United States maintained overwhelming military superiority, both conventional and nuclear. The existence of atomic weapons accelerated discussions about scientific, industrial, and intelligence coordination among Allied states. The United Kingdom had contributed significantly to wartime nuclear research under the Tube Alloys Project, documented in scientific correspondence and agreements. After the war, however, U.S. British nuclear cooperation diminished due to legislative changes in the United States, particularly the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which restricted the sharing of atomic information. This act is a clear documentary marker of how nuclear technology altered alliances. Archival diplomatic communications show that British officials expressed concern about the lack of continued cooperation, while U.S. officials cited national control requirements. By 1946, the United States had produced additional atomic weapons. Although precise production numbers remained classified for decades, declassified documentation indicates expanding enrichment and production capability at Oak Ridge and Hanford. The growth of the U.S. nuclear stockpile significantly shaped strategic planning, as reflected in early military policy papers. The existence of atomic weapons also influenced emerging Cold War policies. While the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan would be developed later, internal memoranda from the U.S. State Department indicate recognition that atomic capability formed part of the broader strategic environment underpinning U.S. diplomatic actions. Although the atomic bomb did not determine these policies, its presence affected geopolitical calculations at multiple levels. In Europe, Soviet actions in Eastern Europe continued concurrently with these developments. Political restructuring in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria proceeded according to documented administrative orders and governmental decrees. Western diplomatic observations, recorded in correspondence, noted increasing control by local communist parties. Although atomic weapons did not alter these internal developments directly, the U.S. response to them occurred in a global context in which the United States possessed nuclear superiority. The first documented international proposals for atomic regulation emerged during this period. In January 1946, the United Nations established the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, UNAEC, tasked with developing recommendations for the control of atomic energy. U.S. government representatives presented proposals for the international management of nuclear materials, while Soviet representatives supported alternative frameworks. These disagreements prevented the establishment of a unified system of control. UNAEC meeting minutes document the absence of consensus. Between August 1945 and the end of 1946, atomic weapons remained exclusively in U.S. possession. This condition established a strategic asymmetry. The United States began formulating military plans that incorporated atomic capability, while the Soviet Union accelerated its own research. The presence of atomic weapons did not cause open confrontation during this period, but it altered military, diplomatic, and industrial planning on both sides. The early Cold War structure, characterized by asymmetrical capabilities and expanding spheres of influence, emerged under these conditions. The strategic environment created in 1945 to 1946 continued until 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device, documented at the Semipalatinsk test site. Until that moment, the United States maintained a monopoly on atomic weapons. The years between 1945 and 1949, therefore, constitute the first phase of nuclear influence on the transition from World War II to the Cold War, a period defined by U.S. nuclear superiority and rapid global reorganization. The existence of atomic weapons set the stage for later developments in U.S. and Soviet strategy, including containment, the Marshall Plan, and the militarization described in NSC 68. Although the atomic bomb did not directly determine diplomatic actions, its documented presence influenced the calculations, negotiations, and security assessments that defined the post-war order. Between 1945 and 1947, Political and administrative changes in Eastern Europe reshaped the post-war international order. These changes were documented through government decrees, occupation reports, diplomatic correspondence, and records of national elections. During this period, the Soviet Union exercised control across territories that its military had occupied during the final stages of the Second World War. The political structures established in these areas became a central factor in the emerging Cold War. At the conclusion of the war, Soviet military forces occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and parts of Austria and Germany. The Red Army's presence is well documented in operational records and occupation reports. As the war ended, interim local governments, some created in 1944 as Soviet forces advanced, became the administrative basis for post-war political development. These governments varied in composition but shared a common feature. Communist parties held significant organizational capacity through support from Soviet military authorities. Poland was the first major area of political restructuring after Germany's defeat. The Yalta Conference, February 1945, had produced a declaration on liberated Europe, calling for the establishment of a provisional Polish government through the inclusion of additional political figures beyond the Soviet-backed Lublin Committee. In June 1945, the Provisional Government of National Unity was established. Western diplomats observed its formation and recorded its composition in dispatches, noting participation from non-communist representatives, though communist figures held key ministries. In January 1947, parliamentary elections were held under the supervision of the provisional government. Reports by international observers and diplomatic missions documented irregularities, including restricted access for opposition groups and administrative control exercised by the Ministry of Public Security. Official results showed a majority for the communist-aligned bloc. These records confirm that by early 1947, Poland had a government aligned closely with the Soviet Union, and the political framework remained in place thereafter. Romania experienced rapid political restructuring beginning in 1945. Following King Michael's August 1944 proclamation that ended Romania's alliance with Germany, Soviet forces occupied the country. In March 1945, a new government headed by Petru Groza was formed, documented in diplomatic correspondence as having strong participation from the Romanian Communist Party. The king's authority was limited to symbolic functions. Throughout 1945 and 1946, Soviet occupation authorities supervised land reforms, administrative reorganizations, and the restructuring of internal security agencies. Romania held elections in November 1946. Official government results showed a clear victory for the governing coalition led by the Communists. Foreign diplomatic reports documented restricted activity for opposition parties. In December 1947, King Michael abdicated, and the Romanian People's Republic was proclaimed, formalizing a new political structure aligned with the Soviet Union. Bulgaria's transformation followed a similar pattern. The Fatherland Front coalition formed a new government in September 1944, shortly before the arrival of Soviet troops, and continued governing the country after the war. The Communist Party held influence within the coalition, supported by the restructuring of internal security institutions. In 1945, documented political reforms included the suspension of existing political parties and the establishment of a new electoral framework. Elections in October 1945 resulted in a Fatherland Front victory, and subsequent administrative decisions expanded the authority of the Communist Party. In September 1946, a referendum abolished the monarchy and Bulgaria became a republic. The National Assembly elections of 1946 confirmed the dominance of the governing coalition, and by 1947, with the adoption of a new constitution, Bulgaria's political alignment was firmly established. Hungary experienced political competition longer than some other Eastern European states. After the German occupation ended in 1945, a provisional government was formed under Soviet supervision. Parliamentary elections in November 1945 produced a victory for the Independent Smallholders Party, which received significant public support. Communist participation in the government, however, was ensured through documented agreements supported by the Allied Control Commission, led by the Soviet Union. Between 1946 and 1947, internal political changes occurred. Governmental decrees expanded the authority of internal security services, and several leading members of the Smallholders Party were arrested or forced to resign. Diplomatic correspondence from U.S. and British missions recorded these events. In August 1947, elections produced a result favorable to the Communist Party and its allies. A subsequent constitutional reorganization continued the consolidation of administrative structures. Czechoslovakia followed a different trajectory initially, maintaining a multi-party government after the war. The National Front, composed of several political parties including communists, formed the basis of the government. Elections in May 1946 gave the Communist Party the largest share of votes, particularly in the Czech regions. However, the country retained multiple active political groups, and its internal documents show regular cabinet deliberations with broad participation. Although Czechoslovakia did not undergo the same rapid consolidation seen in other states during 1945 to 1947, diplomatic correspondence from this period indicates that the Communist Party held increasing influence in state security institutions. The decisive shift would occur later in 1948, but the structures that facilitated that change were already present by the end of 1947. Yugoslavia and Albania underwent political restructuring outside direct Soviet military occupation, but remained relevant to the period's regional developments. In Yugoslavia, the partisan movement under Josip Broz Tito established control as documented in military and administrative records. The monarchy was abolished in November 1945 following elections supervised by the provisional government. Albania conducted elections in December 1945, establishing a new government that later proclaimed a republic. Although political alignments varied, these states were not under the same administrative arrangements as the Soviet-occupied territories, but contributed to the region's political transformation. The Soviet occupation zone in Germany underwent political reorganization consistent with policies implemented elsewhere in Eastern Europe. In 1945, political parties were licensed under the supervision of the Soviet military administration in Germany. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, and Communist Party of Germany, KPD, were active but operated under occupation oversight. A significant development occurred in April 1946, when leaders of the SPD and KPD in the Soviet zone merged to form the Socialist Unity Party, SED. This merger is documented in party records and Soviet administrative directives. The SED became the dominant political organization within the zone, shaping political developments that would lead to the formation of the German Democratic Republic in 1949. Industrial dismantling also took place. Records from industrial sites, Soviet directives, and Western diplomatic protests documented the removal of machinery, metals, and industrial equipment from the Soviet zone. These actions were undertaken to satisfy reparations claims outlined in the Potsdam Agreements, though implementation varied from initial expectations. Across Eastern Europe, newly established internal security institutions were documented in government decrees and directives. State security ministries or departments expanded their authority to oversee political activity, public administration, and economic planning. These changes were not speculative or inferred. They appear clearly in administrative bulletins, legal orders, and reports from foreign observers. Economic reforms occurred concurrently. Land reforms redistributed agricultural property in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Poland, with the stated goal of reorganizing rural economies. These measures were documented through Land Commission reports and government directives. Industrial nationalization also began during this period, with factories and major enterprises brought under state management. Western diplomatic missions, still present in several Eastern European countries during 1945 to 1947, filed detailed reports concerning political developments. These correspondences noted the restructuring of government ministries, the reduction of opposition participation, and changes in electoral processes. Such reports provide a clear historical record of the evolving political landscape. They did not interpret motives, but documented observable administrative changes, legislative actions, and political outcomes. International organizations also monitored developments. The Allied Control Commissions in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, chaired by the Soviet Union, issued formal communications regarding political and administrative decisions. These documents provide a primary source account of how governance was conducted during the transitional period. By 1947, the political alignment of Eastern Europe was clear. Formal treaties, alliances, and institutional structures would emerge later, but the administrative, electoral, and security frameworks were already documented. The transformation of these states created a contiguous region governed by political systems compatible with those in the Soviet Union. This alignment became a foundational component of early Cold War geopolitics. Western governments documented their observations of these developments in diplomatic reports sent to Washington, London, and Paris. These reports highlighted concerns regarding limited political pluralism, consolidation of internal security institutions, and administrative alignment with Soviet directives. While early responses remained diplomatic rather than confrontational, the documented conditions formed the basis for later Western policy decisions, including the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The political restructuring in Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1947 occurred simultaneously with events in Western Europe, the United States, and Asia, including the establishment of the United Nations, atomic weapons development, and economic recovery planning. The documented consolidation of administrative structures in Eastern Europe was one of the clearest indicators of the broader division that characterized the emerging Cold War order. The period following the Potsdam Conference saw a series of administrative, economic, and political developments that signaled increasing divergence between the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe and the Western powers. While diplomatic correspondence and occupation reports from late 1945 already documented disagreements over Germany, reparations, and political structures in Eastern Europe, these issues had not yet been articulated publicly in a manner that clearly defined the emerging divide. This changed on March 5, 1946, when Winston Churchill delivered an address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, at the invitation of U.S. President Harry S. Truman. The speech is widely cited in governmental archives, newspapers, and official transcripts. It marked the first major public acknowledgement of the geopolitical division that had formed in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Churchill had left office following the British general election of July 1945, but remained an influential political figure. His visit to the United States for the Fulton event was documented in official British and American communications. President Truman introduced Churchill at the college, though the speech itself was not an official government declaration by either state. Nevertheless, the presence of Truman and the timing of the speech gave it international prominence. The Fulton address focused on the post-war international situation. Churchill began by reviewing the wartime alliance and the importance of continued cooperation among major powers. The pivotal statement came when he declared, based on documented conditions in Europe, that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. This phrase summarized the political and administrative division then visible in diplomatic and occupation records. Eastern Europe was under the administrative authority of governments aligned closely with the Soviet Union, while Western Europe remained politically pluralistic and economically connected to the United States and the United Kingdom. The speech referenced specific, documented developments in Eastern Europe. The restructuring of governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The limited participation of non-communist parties in administrative processes. The increasing influence of internal security ministries in these states. The restrictions observed by Western diplomats on opposition political activity. Churchill cited these developments as evidence of a significant political division. All of the conditions he named were documented in reports from U.S., British, and French diplomatic missions operating in Eastern Europe from 1945 to 1946. Churchill also addressed Germany. He stated that Germany should not again become a threat to European security and emphasized the need for Western cooperation to manage German reconstruction. His remarks reflected the documented difficulties within the Allied Control Council, where disagreements over economic administration, reparations, and access rights were preventing unified governance of Germany. Minutes from the Allied Control Council during this period confirm repeated disputes over coal distribution, industrial management, and interzonal policy coordination. The speech also mentioned the need for strong international security arrangements and highlighted the role of the recently established United Nations. Churchill emphasized the importance of maintaining the effectiveness of the United Nations Security Council, whose veto power and voting procedures had been agreed upon at Yalta and finalized in the San Francisco Charter. His remarks aligned with the documented free exercise of veto powers during early Security Council sessions, particularly regarding disputes in Iran and Eastern Europe. Churchill's reference to an Iron Curtain did not create the division he described. The phrase summarized conditions that were already documented by multiple governments. From 1945 to early 1946, political reorganization had advanced in Eastern Europe, and the Western powers had received detailed reports on the administrative consolidation occurring there. The speech brought these developments to wider public attention, marking the first moment in which the division was articulated on a global stage. The speech produced varied official responses, all recorded in diplomatic archives. The Soviet government reacted negatively. The Soviet press, led by official newspapers such as Pravda and Izvestia, published statements criticizing the speech. Diplomatic cables sent from Moscow to Western capitals recorded these reactions. While the Soviet government did not issue a formal policy declaration in response, state media coverage framed the speech as an indication of Western political intentions. The United States government did not endorse or repudiate Churchill's speech officially. President Truman, present at the speech, did not issue a statement associating the U.S. government with Churchill's remarks. Internal memoranda from the U.S. State Department documented mixed evaluations, with some officials noting Churchill's description as consistent with existing diplomatic reports, while others expressed concerns that the speech could complicate ongoing negotiations. In Britain, government reaction was similarly mixed. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, whose Labour government pursued diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, maintained that Churchill spoke as a private individual. British cabinet papers recorded concern about the speech's potential effect on foreign policy, though no official reprimand or endorsement was issued. The conditions Churchill publicly described had emerged gradually from documented political developments in Eastern Europe. As detailed in Segment 5, by early 1946, Poland had formed a provisional government whose composition favored Soviet-aligned parties. Romania's government, led by Petru Groza since March 1945, exercised administrative control with documented support from local communist organizations. Bulgaria's Fatherland Front government continued to restructure political institutions. Hungary's multi-party system remained formally intact, but internal security services, documented in government directives, played an expanded role. The Socialist Unity Party was formed in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany in April 1946. These were administrative realities confirmed in diplomatic cables and occupation reports. Churchill's speech did not interpret motives or assign emotional meaning to these developments. It summarized them publicly using observational language. In addition, tensions within the Allied Control Council were escalating. Minutes from early 1946 documented disagreements over coal allocations between zones, agricultural output distribution, currency stabilization proposals, transport and rail coordination, the extent of reparations removals. The Control Council was formally committed to treating Germany as a single economic unit, as stated in the Potsdam Protocol. However, conflicting administrative policies in the occupation zones, recorded in official directives, made coordinated action increasingly difficult. Churchill's speech referenced Germany's importance as a security issue, aligning with these documented administrative challenges. Although Churchill spoke as a private individual, the Fulton speech influenced how governments described the post-war situation. Western newspapers gave extensive coverage to the speech, reproducing the full text and reporting reactions. As newspaper archives demonstrate, public awareness of the division in Europe increased significantly after March 1946. Government officials across Europe, the United States, and the Soviet Union referenced the speech in subsequent communications. Internal memoranda from the U.S. State Department noted that the speech articulated conditions already present in diplomatic reports. In Britain, parliamentary discussions referenced the speech's political implications. The Soviet Union's communications to other Eastern European states circulated excerpts from the speech as documentation of Western positions. The speech also influenced early academic and policy analyses. Government-funded think tanks and foreign policy research groups began issuing reports assessing the political situation in Europe. These analyses, documented in institutional archives, often cited Churchill's description as a concise summary of the division forming across the continent. The Fulton speech occurred during a period when multiple events signaled a shift in post-war relations. In February 1946, George F. Kennan submitted the Long Telegram from Moscow, a detailed analysis of Soviet foreign policy. Although not publicly released until 1947 as the X article, it circulated within the U.S. government immediately. In March and April 1946, negotiations over Iran intensified. Soviet forces had not withdrawn from northern Iran by the March deadline, leading to Security Council discussions documented in UN records. European economic crises continued, with documented shortages of coal and food, influencing Western reconstruction planning. German administrative fragmentation grew more pronounced, as documented in Allied Control Council disagreements. Several Eastern European states continued issuing decrees that consolidated internal security authority and restructured political institutions. Churchill's speech did not cause these developments, but reflected and publicly articulated them. It marked a turning point in public understanding of international conditions because it framed documented political changes in geographical terms that were clear to global audiences. The immediate aftermath of the speech did not alter diplomatic relations formally. No treaties were revoked, and no new alliances were formed in direct response. The documented significance of the speech lies not in policy changes, but in its articulation of observable geopolitical realities. The speech helped establish terminology and conceptual structure for interpreting the post-war international order. The phrase "Iron Curtain," widely reproduced, provided a descriptive shorthand for the division confirmed in diplomatic, military, and administrative records from this period. Historians rely heavily on documented primary sources from 1945 to 1947, election results, governmental decrees, Allied Control Council minutes, diplomatic cables, UN Security Council records, and occupation reports to trace the emergence of the Cold War structure. Churchill's speech summarized these sources rather than creating new conditions. By early 1946, diplomatic communications and occupation reports from Europe documented widening administrative and political differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Although cooperation continued in several formal bodies, including the Allied Control Council and the United Nations, the documented record of disagreements grew steadily. It was in this context that one of the most influential pieces of diplomatic analysis of the period emerged: George F. Kennan's Long Telegram sent from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to the State Department on February 22, 1946. Kennan, then Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow, responded to a State Department request for analysis following a series of Soviet communications concerning international economic institutions. His reply, totaling more than 8,000 words, provided a detailed assessment of Soviet foreign policy based on documented Soviet statements, administrative structures, and diplomatic actions. The telegram was classified but circulated widely among U.S. government departments, including the White House, the Pentagon, and the Office of Naval Intelligence. Kennan's telegram stated that Soviet policy was shaped by a long-term perspective rooted in security concerns and ideological commitments documented in official Soviet communications. However, the telegram did not attribute motives beyond what could be observed in public statements and administrative actions. Instead, Kennan emphasized the consistent pattern of Soviet diplomatic behavior as reflected in Soviet voting in the United Nations Security Council, public speeches by the Soviet leadership, actions taken in Eastern Europe from 1944 to 1946, communications during the ongoing Iranian crisis. The telegram argued that the United States should adopt a long-term, steady policy of countering Soviet expansion where it appeared in documented actions. It did not recommend military confrontation, but called for comprehensive political, economic, and diplomatic firmness. The long telegram became one of the most widely circulated internal documents in U.S. foreign policy history. Archival records show that it influenced discussions within the State Department throughout 1946 and was included in several policy briefings. Although not released publicly at the time, its ideas formed the basis of later published arguments. Kennan's telegram circulated while the United Nations was addressing the first major international dispute of the post-war era, the presence of Soviet troops in northern Iran. Under the 1942 Allied Treaty with Iran, British and Soviet forces were permitted on Iranian territory during the war, but were expected to withdraw within 6 months of its end. By early 1946, British forces had withdrawn, but Soviet forces remained in the north. Diplomatic records from Iran, the United States, and the United Kingdom documented Iranian appeals to the United Nations. On January 30th, 1946, Iran formally brought the issue before the Security Council. The Soviet delegation initially argued that negotiations with the Iranian government were ongoing. Security Council transcripts recorded debates throughout February and March. Soviet withdrawal occurred by late May 1946, following bilateral agreements with Iran. The crisis provided contemporary evidence of the type of international disputes referenced in Kennan's telegram. It also influenced U.S. assessments of global stability, as documented in memoranda prepared for the Truman administration. In July 1947, the journal Foreign Affairs published an article titled "The Sources of Soviet Conduct," written under the pseudonym X. The author was George Kennan. The article restated the core arguments of the long telegram in a public forum, though without divulging classified content. It, 1. described the nature of Soviet foreign policy as reflected in documented official statements. 2. reviewed post-war diplomatic behavior as observed through public actions. And 3. argued for a general strategy of containment. The X article did not contain calls for confrontation or military escalation. Instead, it emphasized the need for consistent pressure through political and economic means, reflecting the documented conditions of the time. The article became widely circulated in policy circles and among academic institutions. Press coverage from mid-1947 shows that it quickly shaped public discussion about U.S. foreign policy. Although the article did not create a U.S. containment policy, it summarized a viewpoint based on documented diplomatic behavior and provided a publicly available framework that aligned with internal policy discussions. The period between Kennan's telegram and the Truman Doctrine saw several documented developments in Europe that contributed to growing policy concern in the United States and its allies. Eastern European political restructuring continued. Elections, administrative decrees, and security reforms were documented in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and East Germany. Allied Control Council disagreements intensified. Minutes from 1946 recorded repeated failures to reach agreement on coal shipments, industrial distribution, and budgetary planning for Germany. Several directives required unanimous consent. Lack of agreement prevented implementation. German food shortages worsened. Data collected by Allied economic offices in late 1946 recorded dangerously low caloric availability in the Western zones, contributing to broader strategic concerns. Civil conflict in Greece continued following wartime resistance movements. British forces had intervened in Greece in 1944 to stabilize the government, but by 1946, armed conflict persisted between government forces and insurgent groups. British reports submitted to the United States in early 1947 documented growing financial strain on London. These developments formed part of the environment in which the next major U.S. policy shift occurred, the Truman Doctrine. On March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress. The official transcript, preserved in the congressional record, outlined a request for financial and military assistance to Greece and Turkey. The British government had notified the United States in February 1947 that it could no longer provide support to these states due to financial constraints. This communication is documented in British Foreign Office papers and U.S. diplomatic correspondence. Truman's message to Congress described the existing political and economic conditions in Greece and Turkey based on official reports. In Greece, government forces required assistance to maintain stability amid ongoing armed conflict. In Turkey, government communications indicated financial need for modernizing defense capabilities, as documented in U.S. State Department reports. Truman requested $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey, along with authorization to send U.S. personnel to assist in the administration and oversight of assistance programs. No combat deployment was requested. The policy outlined in the address became known as the Truman Doctrine. The congressional response was documented through debates and committee reports. Both the House and Senate passed the aid package, and the program was signed into law in May 1947. The U.S. government subsequently established missions in Greece and Turkey to administer and monitor assistance. Reports from these missions documented the allocation of funds and military equipment. The Truman Doctrine marked the first formal public statement of U.S. policy that aligned with the analytical framework outlined in Kennan's long telegram. While the doctrine did not reference containment explicitly, its structure corresponded to the idea of supporting countries facing documented instability that might affect international security. The announcement of the Truman Doctrine was widely reported in newspapers across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Press archives show substantial commentary regarding the implications of U.S. involvement in Greek and Turkish affairs. The Soviet government protested the policy in diplomatic communications, arguing that it represented interference in regional matters. These protests were recorded in exchanges through the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, although no formal action followed. Diplomatic records show that the Truman Doctrine altered the strategic calculations of several European states. France, Italy, and other countries receiving reports from their U.S. counterparts began assessing how American policy might relate to their post-war economic needs. British and French diplomatic archives show correspondence referencing the doctrine as a sign of greater long-term U.S. engagement in European affairs. From March 1947 onward, containment became the central organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. Though the term had not yet been formalized in governmental directives, internal memoranda show clear adoption of Kennan's analysis as a policy guide. State Department planning documents from mid-1947 referenced the need for sustained, long-term political and economic measures to maintain stability in Europe and the Middle East. By mid-1947, documented assessments from European governments, U.S. diplomatic missions, and international relief agencies described widespread economic instability across the continent. Industrial production in many Western European countries remained significantly below pre-war levels. Coal shortages in the winter of 1946 to 1947 disrupted transportation and electricity generation in multiple regions. Agricultural shortages persisted in several countries due to wartime destruction, lack of fertilizer, damaged equipment, and displaced labor. These conditions were recorded extensively in economic reports submitted to the United States, Britain, France, and international organizations such as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA. The United States had already taken initial steps to provide limited assistance through loans and relief programs. However, by the spring of 1947, U.S. government analyses, documented in State Department memoranda, National Advisory Council reports, and Treasury summaries, concluded that a coordinated European recovery effort was necessary to stabilize the continent. This assessment formed the backdrop to Secretary of State George C. Marshall's address delivered at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The speech, preserved in full in U.S. Department of State records, outlined a proposal for a European recovery program. Marshall described the economic condition of Europe using data from official investigations, declining industrial capacity, shortages of coal and food, and the inability of several governments to finance reconstruction. Marshall stated that the United States would support a recovery program, but only if European countries themselves formulated a cooperative plan for how assistance would be used. He emphasized the need for joint economic coordination among European governments. Notably, Marshall's speech stated that the program would be open to all European countries willing to participate, without reference to political alignment. This condition appears explicitly in the official transcript. The speech did not mention the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe by name. Instead, it focused on economic requirements and practical reconstruction needs. Following the speech, the French and British governments initiated consultations on how to respond. Documents from the French Foreign Ministry and British Foreign Office show that both governments supported organizing a conference to coordinate European participation. They invited the Soviet Union to attend preliminary discussions in Paris. The Soviet delegation, led by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, attended the initial meetings in late June 1947. Meeting minutes from the Paris consultations recorded significant differences between Soviet and Western views. The Western governments proposed a continent-wide program requiring detailed economic data and a coordinated reconstruction framework. The Soviet delegation objected to data sharing requirements and expressed concerns about restrictions implied by the program structure, as documented in French and British conference notes. Molotov left the conference on July 2, 1947, and the Soviet Union declined participation in the recovery program. Following the Soviet withdrawal, the governments of Eastern European states received communications from Moscow advising against participation. Archival materials from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary confirmed that initial interest in attending further discussions was reversed after consultations with Soviet representatives. Czechoslovakia, for example, initially announced acceptance of the invitation but withdrew after discussions in Moscow, as documented in the Czechoslovak cabinet meeting minutes from July 1947. Thus, participation in the proposed European recovery program split along emerging geopolitical lines. Western Europe accepted the invitation, while Eastern Europe did not. Between July and September 1947, 16 Western European countries sent representatives to Paris to draft the cooperative economic plan requested by the United States. These countries included the United Kingdom, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Ireland, Switzerland, Portugal, Greece and Turkey, Austria, and West Germany, represented indirectly through occupation authorities. Meeting records from the CEC document discussions on industrial targets, agricultural needs, transportation restoration, and financial requirements. The committee's final report, submitted in September 1947, estimated that Europe required approximately $22 billion $1,947 over 4 years to recover. Following review by the Truman administration and the U.S. Congress, the European Recovery Program, ERP, commonly known as the Marshall Plan, was enacted as law on April 3, 1948. The final legislation was recorded as the Foreign Assistance Act of 1948. The plan provided for multi-year U.S. financial aid, machinery, raw materials, fuel, technical assistance, and food supplies. An administrative agency, the Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA, was established to oversee implementation. The ECA worked directly with European governments, whose coordination was facilitated by the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEC, created in April 1948 as part of the recovery structure. The ECA's records document the distribution of resources, monitoring of reconstruction milestones, and collaboration on industrial modernization. Documents from the Soviet Foreign Ministry and speeches by Soviet leaders during 1947 to 1948 show opposition to the Marshall Plan, describing it as inconsistent with Soviet economic policies. Soviet-aligned states in Eastern Europe implemented their own economic programs, including land reforms, nationalization of industries, and 5-year plans modeled on Soviet administrative structures. These measures are documented in legislative records from Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. In 1949, the Soviet Union established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, to coordinate economic policies among socialist states. Although Comecon's formation falls outside the 1947 to 1948 timeframe of this segment, its roots lie in the documented economic divergence solidifying during the implementation of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan did not create immediate economic recovery, but documented data from the OEC and the ECA show measurable improvements between 1948 and 1951. Industrial production increased by more than 30% over pre-ERP levels across participating countries. Agricultural yields improved due to fertilizer imports and equipment modernization. Transportation networks, railways, ports, and roads were rebuilt under coordinated planning. European currencies stabilized through coordinated monetary policies. Cross-border trade expanded as tariffs and restrictions were adjusted among participating nations. These developments appear in annual OEC reports and contemporaneous economic analyses. Germany's economy was divided between the Western occupation zones and the Soviet zone. The Marshall Plan applied only to the Western zones. ECA records from 1948 show that significant quantities of coal, machinery, and industrial materials were directed to the Western zones as part of their integration into the recovery program. The Soviet zone, meanwhile, continued industrial dismantling and transferred economic assets eastward as reparations. Soviet military administration documents record the removal of machinery and industrial plants, while Western occupation authorities documented reconstruction efforts in their respective zones. These economic differences contributed directly to the growing division between the U.S. supported Western zones, which moved toward integration and eventual state formation, the Soviet-administered Eastern Zone, which developed under a different economic framework. This division became a central factor in the later formation of two separate German states in 1949. The Marshall Plan also had political implications, though these were secondary to its primary economic goals. Parliamentary debates in Western Europe frequently referenced the program as a mechanism for stabilizing democratic institutions and reducing economic volatility. Government records from Italy, France, and the Benelux states document approval votes, budgetary planning, and cooperative agreements tied to ERP participation. In Eastern Europe, government documents reflect alignment with Soviet economic planning, including nationalization of industries and collectivization of agriculture. These policies, enacted between 1947 and 1948, are recorded in formal legislative acts. By early 1948, Germany's economic and administrative status had become the central issue in post-war European reconstruction. The Allied Control Council, responsible for governing Germany as a single economic unit under the Potsdam Protocol, had experienced increasing difficulty coordinating policies across occupation zones. Meeting records from 1946 to 1948 documented repeated disagreements over coal distribution, industrial output, transport coordination, and reparations. By this time, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were administering their zones under divergent economic frameworks. The German Reichsmark, which remained in circulation after the war, had become unstable. Allied economic reports from the British and American zones in early 1948 recorded severe shortages of basic goods, widespread use of barter, and the growth of an unofficial black market. Industrial and agricultural production was constrained not only by wartime destruction, but also by the lack of a functioning currency. British and American occupation authorities concluded that currency reform was necessary to stabilize the economy and facilitate recovery. Documentation from the Bizonal Economic Council, created by the U.S. and British occupation authorities in January 1947 to administer the combined Anglo-American zones, shows that discussions on currency reform began in late 1947. French participation increased when the French zone joined the bizonal system in June 1948. though significant cooperation between the French and Anglo-American administrations had already been underway. Currency reform required agreement within the Allied Control Council, but the Soviet delegation opposed proposals that involved limiting reparations or restructuring the economic system in the Western zones. Control Council minutes from March and April 1948 show that negotiations failed to reach a consensus. The inability to secure a four-power agreement compelled the Western Allies to proceed independently. On June 18, 1948, the U.S., British, and French occupation authorities issued a joint communiqué announcing that a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, DM, would be introduced in their zones beginning on June 20th. Each zone distributed official directives outlining the conversion process, limits on retained Reichsmark notes, and procedures for bank account adjustments. This reform was documented in occupation laws and administrative orders filed in each of the Western zones. On June 21, 1948, the Deutsche Mark was also introduced in the western sectors of Berlin. Although Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet occupation zone, it was governed by four-power arrangements established in 1945. Western authorities asserted that their legal jurisdiction in their sectors of Berlin permitted them to implement currency reform there as well. The Soviet authorities disputed Western jurisdiction on this issue. The Soviet military administration responded by issuing its own currency, an East Mark equivalent, on June 24, 1948, intended for use across the Soviet zone and in East Berlin. Administrative orders required residents to exchange old Reichsmarks for the new Soviet-backed currency. Soviet representatives in the Allied Kommandantur, the governing body for Berlin, objected formally to the Western introduction of the Deutsche Mark in the city. On the same day, June 24, 1948, the Soviet occupation authorities imposed restrictions on all surface access routes to the western sectors of Berlin. Documentation from Allied military transport offices recorded the closure of rail lines, the interruption of barge traffic on canals, and the suspension of road access through the Soviet zone. The Soviets cited administrative inconsistencies related to currency as the basis for these measures, but no four-power agreement authorizing such restrictions existed. These actions effectively cut off the western sectors of Berlin, which depended heavily on external supplies for food, fuel, and raw materials. Allied logistical reports from the period documented the extent of this dependence, noting that only limited reserves were available within the city. The closure of land routes was assessed immediately by Allied occupation authorities in Berlin and by senior military commands in Frankfurt, London, and Washington. Meeting notes from the U.S. British Combined Chiefs of Staff and communications between the U.S. Air Force in Europe and the Pentagon show that alternatives were examined, including negotiation and potential ground convoys. However, air corridors established in 1945 under formal four-power agreements remained open, and these corridors provided a documented legal basis for air access. Internal memoranda from the U.S. Air Force and Royal Air Force in late June 1948 outlined supply requirements and early logistical estimates. These reports formed the basis for the decision to supply the city entirely by air, a plan known as the Berlin Airlift, which would begin on June 26, 1948, and become the subject of the next segment. The blockade marked the functional end of the Allied Control Council. After March 20, 1948, when the Soviet representative walked out of a meeting over disagreements regarding economic and administrative issues. The Council never again conducted effective four-power governance. The Berlin Blockade confirmed this breakdown. Official records show that no Control Council meetings successfully convened after the imposition of the blockade. The Kommandantura in Berlin attempted several sessions to resolve administrative disputes, but meeting minutes from late June and July 1948 show that no agreement could be reached. Western representatives continued to assert their right to maintain their sectors of Berlin under existing occupation law, while the Soviet delegation maintained that currency introduction violated previous agreements. The blockade was therefore not an isolated act, but the culmination of documented disputes surrounding the administration of Germany, currency regulation, reparations, and the structure of European recovery. The Soviet response to Western currency reform created the first major confrontation between the former wartime allies. The blockade tested the viability of four-power arrangements in Berlin, tested Allied access rights under existing occupation agreements, created an immediate need for large-scale logistical action, brought public attention to the economic and political division in Germany. Newspapers across Europe and the United States reported the blockade extensively, using official Allied statements, Soviet press releases, and on-the-ground reports from Berlin. The blockade also coincided with the early implementation of the Marshall Plan, documented. At the international level, the United Nations Security Council received communications regarding the blockade, though debates produced no binding resolution. Transcripts from Security Council sessions show procedural disagreements among permanent members, preventing unified action. The Soviet blockade of land and water routes into West Berlin on June 24, 1948 marked the most confrontational between the Allied powers since the end of the Second World War. Records from the U.S., British, and French occupation authorities documented the immediate effect. Rail lines from Helmstedt were halted, barge traffic through the Soviet-administered waterways was stopped, and motor access through the Soviet zone was suspended. Western sectors of Berlin, with a population of more than 2 million people, were cut off from normal supply routes. Despite the closure of land routes, 3 air corridors into Berlin, North, Central, and South, remained open under four-power agreements established in 1945. These rights were documented in Allied Control Council aviation regulations. The Soviet blockade did not extend to the airspace agreed upon for supply flights, and no formal Soviet order restricted air access. After reviewing transport requirements and legal documentation, U.S. military leadership determined that supplying the city by air was feasible. Lieutenant General Curtis E. LeMay and Major General William H. Tunner were assigned operational planning responsibilities. British authorities simultaneously reviewed their own aviation capabilities. Early internal memoranda from the U.S. Air Force in Europe and the Royal Air Force record cargo tonnage estimates, fuel needs, and anticipated flight schedules. On June 26, 1948, the United States initiated the first supply flights into Berlin. The operation was initially known as Operation Vittles, with the British component named Operation Planefare. Airlift logs from Tempelhof Air Base, Gatto, and Tegel documented incoming loads of flour, powdered milk, medicine, coal, and fuel. Early flights began with fewer than 100 aircraft per day, relying heavily on C-47 Skytran transport planes. On June 28, 1948, the British began their first major flight operations. By early July, the U.S. Air Force had deployed C-54 Skymaster aircraft capable of carrying significantly larger loads. Military records show that by mid-July, daily deliveries reached approximately 1,500 tons. Military and occupation reports documented significant logistical challenges requiring rapid expansion of infrastructure. Runway construction. Tegel Airport was built in the French sector of Berlin in less than 90 days. French authorities, in coordination with Berlin municipal workers, recorded the use of over 19,000 laborers and rapid construction techniques to complete an operational runway by November 1948. Aircraft scheduling. General Tunner implemented a strict flight schedule documented in tactical orders, one aircraft landing every 3 minutes. Records show that aircraft approaching Tempelhof or Gatto were required to land or return without circling, minimizing delays. Weather adjustments. Meteorological logs from the period show heavy fog and winter icing in late 1948. Radar-assisted landing systems and ground-controlled approach technology were expanded to maintain operational capacity. The Soviet authorities issued administrative protests but did not interfere directly with aircraft in the corridors. Western records note several instances of Soviet aircraft flying near the corridors, but no documented collision or interception occurred. Diplomatic communications from Moscow to Western capitals criticized the airlift, but no formal restrictions were imposed on air rights. Allied records show that the Soviet position focused on negotiations linked to the currency issue and Berlin governance. Throughout late 1948, the United Nations Security Council held several discussions concerning Berlin. The Council did not adopt a binding resolution due to disagreements among permanent members. Transcripts from these sessions show procedural disputes rather than operational deliberations. Airlift cargo manifests provide detailed evidence of the operation scale. Supplies included food, grain, sugar, fats, dried vegetables, powdered milk. Medical supplies. Coal, which required specialized loading procedures. Machinery and spare parts to maintain power plants. Berlin municipal records documented consumption rates and electricity usage during the winter months. Coal shipments were especially significant, requiring aircrews to master loading methods that minimized dust and optimized weight distribution. The U.S. Air Force developed documented procedures using heavy sacks and later bulk loading systems. By early 1949, the airlift reached peak efficiency. On April 16, 1949, known as the Easter Parade, U.S. and British aircraft delivered 12,940 tons of supplies in a single day, a record confirmed in both Air Force reports and Berlin occupation office files. This demonstrated that the Western Allies could supply the city indefinitely if required. Operational statistics from April, May 1949 show sustained daily deliveries exceeding 8,000 tons, surpassing the minimum level required to maintain essential civilian needs. Aircraft maintenance logs from the period documented near-continuous operations, with mechanical teams working in shifts to maintain the transport fleet. In early 1949, diplomatic discussions resumed indirectly through the United Nations and other channels. Records from the four-power ambassadors' meetings in New York show negotiations focused on restoring access rights and resolving currency administration issues. On May 4, 1949, After extensive discussions, the Allied powers and the Soviet Union reached an understanding documented in the four-power communique: land, rail, and water access to Berlin would be restored. Four-power meetings on German and Berlin administration would resume. The blockade would end on May 12, 1949. When the blockade officially ended at 1 minute past midnight on May 12th, Allied observers recorded the reopening of checkpoints, resumption of rail traffic, and restoration of canal routes. Although the blockade ended in May, the Western Allies continued the airlift until September 30th, 1949, to build reserve supplies within West Berlin. ECA reports on German recovery documented the importance of these stockpiles as West Germany implemented economic reforms and political institutions. By the end of the airlift, operational records documented over 277,000 flights, more than 2.3 million tons of supplies delivered, 0 aircraft lost due to hostile action. These statistics appear consistently in U.S. Air Force summaries and British Air Ministry reports. The Berlin airlift had measurable geopolitical consequences. Permanent division of Germany. Even before the airlift ended, political developments in the Western zones led to the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, on May 23, 1949. Documentation of the Parliamentary Council and the Basic Law confirms this transition. The German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was established on October 7, 1949 in the Soviet zone. Foundation for Western Defense Cooperation. The airlift reinforced assessments within Western governments that collective security arrangements were necessary. Diplomatic records from 1948 to 1949 documented increasing planning that culminated in the formation of NATO in April 1949. Shift in public perception. International press coverage, relying on official daily airlift reports, made Berlin a visible symbol of post-war division. This was not a psychological interpretation, but a documented effect measured by newspaper circulation, public statements, and parliamentary debates. By early 1948 to 1949, documented diplomatic correspondence between Western governments indicated growing concern about long-term security arrangements in Europe. The Berlin Blockade, June 1948 to May 1949, had revealed the limitations of existing four-power structures. Minutes of the Brussels Treaty Organization, BTO, formed on March 17, 1948 by the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, record the first formal Western European defense commitment. The Brussels Treaty included provisions for military cooperation and collective defense, but its signatories acknowledged the need for broader support, particularly from the United States and Canada. Throughout 1948, U.S. officials from the State Department and National Security Council reviewed European proposals for a transatlantic defense arrangement. Memoranda drafted by George C. Marshall, Dean Acheson, and policy planners, including records from the policy planning staff, demonstrated an ongoing evaluation of European security requirements. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin formally proposed a North Atlantic Security Pact in January 1948, as documented in communications between London and Washington. Discussions intensified during the Berlin Blockade. Meeting notes from U.S., British, Canadian working groups show that a collective defense framework was considered essential to prevent future disruptions to Western access and cooperation. By late 1948, negotiations expanded to include Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Portugal, and Italy, whose representatives submitted security assessments and conditions for participation. These negotiations are extensively documented in State Department files, British Foreign Office records, and Canadian Cabinet committees on external affairs. A series of drafts circulated among the prospective signatories throughout 1948 and early 1949, defining the scope of mutual defense obligations, the geographic area covered, and the organizational structure of the proposed alliance. Negotiations concluded in early 1949. The text of the North Atlantic Treaty was finalized in Washington, D.C. The official treaty, published in the U.S. Treaty Series and recorded in the National Archives of all signatory states, set out geographic limits of the alliance, collective defense obligations under Article 5, requirements for political consultation, provisions for peaceful resolution of disputes, conditions for admitting additional members. Article 5, which states that an armed attack against one member shall be considered an attack against all, became the central component of the treaty. The article did not require automatic military action. Instead, it obligated each member to take actions it deemed necessary, consistent with national legislative procedures. This wording appears in the final ratified document without alteration. On April 4, 1949, representatives of 12 nations signed the treaty in Washington, D.C., United States, Canada, United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, and Portugal. The ceremony was documented in photographic records, broadcast transcripts, and government publications. The signing created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, although the organizational structure was developed in stages following ratification. Each member state submitted a document for debates on budget commitments, military integration, command structure, the legal scope of Article 5. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty on July 21, 1949 by a recorded vote. Similar approval procedures occurred in other signatory states. Once a majority ratified the treaty, NATO formally entered into force. To implement the treaty, member governments established a defense committee, military working groups, and planning boards. These bodies prepared reports on shared defense requirements, force integration, and strategic needs. Early documents, including the strategic concept for the defense of the North Atlantic area, December 1949, outlined initial defense planning parameters. The establishment of NATO coincided with major political changes in Germany. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was formally established on May 23, 1949, following the drafting and adoption of the Basic Law by the Parliamentary Council. This development was documented in occupation directives and West German governmental records. The creation of a West German state aligned with the Western powers further clarified the division already documented through economic and political developments since 1945. Although West Germany was not a founding NATO member, discussions about its future role in European security began immediately after its establishment. These discussions, documented in diplomatic communications, laid the groundwork for West German accession in 1955. The Soviet Union responded to NATO's formation through official statements published in Pravda and communications to Eastern European governments. These statements characterized the treaty as a military alignment inconsistent with earlier wartime cooperation. Eastern European states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Soviet zone of Germany, issued policy declarations supporting continued cooperation under Soviet-led structures. While the Warsaw Pact would not form until 1955, documented actions in 1949 already show increasing coordination within the Eastern Bloc, meetings among defense ministers, expansion of internal security institutions, continued nationalization of industry, and integration of economic planning. These administrative developments were recorded in state documents and provided the early foundation for the Eastern Alliance system. NATO's formation occurred within a global environment shaped by several documented events. Continued disagreements in the United Nations Security Council, including disputes over veto usage and Cold War-related issues, ongoing reconstruction under the Marshall Plan, documented in OEC annual reports, increased Soviet investment in industrial and military capacity, including the accelerating atomic program, leading to the first Soviet test in August 1949. These events contributed to the geopolitical environment in which NATO emerged as a formal structure. NATO's establishment formalized the security alignment of Western Europe and North America. The alliance provided a documented mechanism for joint military planning, a political forum for consultation, a structure for integrating defense policies. Although NATO did not deploy integrated military forces immediately, planning documents from 1949 show the beginning of coordinated strategies, shared intelligence assessments, and discussions on force contributions. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe continued to operate under documented Soviet administrative guidance, forming a separate and increasingly institutionalized bloc. By the end of 1949, Europe was thus divided into two formal groupings: the NATO alliance, representing Western Europe and North America; the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc, coordinated through political and economic mechanisms that would become more formal in subsequent years. By 1949, the international system that had emerged after the Second World War was undergoing major structural changes. Documented developments in Europe, including the Berlin Blockade, the formation of NATO, and the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, were already altering the balance of power. Two additional documented events dramatically expanded the geographical scope of the early Cold War: the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic device on August 29, 1949, and the proclamation of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its first successful nuclear test at the Semipalatinsk testing site in Kazakhstan. Archival materials, now publicly available, include military reports, scientific documentation from the Soviet nuclear program, and engineering logs from Research Facility No. 2, Artemis 16. These records show that the device tested, known in Western intelligence as JO-1, was a plutonium implosion-type bomb. Soviet authorities did not publicly announce the test at the time. The United States detected the test through atmospheric sampling. U.S. Air Force reconnaissance aircraft collected airborne radioactive particles over the North Pacific in early September 1949. Laboratory analysis performed at the Air Force Cambridge Research Center confirmed the presence of isotopes consistent with nuclear detonation. President Truman publicly announced the detection of a Soviet test on September 23, 1949. The text of Truman's statement appears in official White House archives. This event ended the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons, a position it had held since 1945. Before 1949, U.S. military planning documents and National Security Council reports had been drafted with the assumption that no other state possessed atomic capability. The documented Soviet test altered the global strategic environment immediately. Within weeks of Truman's announcement, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Atomic Energy Commission, and the National Security Council produced reports assessing the consequences. These documents, declassified decades later, show recognition that the United States would need to expand its nuclear stockpile, assessment of civil defense requirements for U.S. metropolitan areas, review of intelligence gaps on Soviet industrial capacity, acceleration of research into thermonuclear weapons. The U.S. decision to pursue a hydrogen bomb program emerged from these assessments. Minutes from NSC meetings in late 1949 and early 1950 document this process, culminating in Truman's directive in January 1950 to proceed with thermonuclear development. The Soviet test also influenced NATO's early planning. Although NATO had been formed months earlier in April 1949, its initial strategic documents, such as the December 1949 Strategic Concept for the Defense of the North Atlantic Area, were drafted in direct response to the new nuclear balance. Military planning records from NATO's Defense Committee show increased emphasis on air defense, coordinated warning systems, and the standardization of military equipment. Before 1949, the primary documented areas of tension were located in Europe and the Near East. The Soviet nuclear test extended the strategic scope of the Cold War to a global level, requiring the United States to consider new calculations for both Asia and the Pacific. This shift coincided with a major political change in China. The Chinese Civil War, which resumed after the end of the Second World War between the nationalist government, Kuomintang, and the Chinese Communist Party, escalated significantly between 1946 and 1949. U.S. diplomatic cables from Nanjing and later from Canton documented nationalist difficulties, including declining troop morale, administrative fragmentation, inflation, and territorial losses. Communist forces under the People's Liberation Army, PLA, advanced steadily. Military operations such as the Liaoshen, Huaihai, and Pingjin campaigns, 1948 to 1949, are well documented in Chinese military archives and foreign military intelligence assessments. These campaigns resulted in the collapse of nationalist control in northern and central China. In January 1949, Beijing came under communist control. By April 1949, PLA forces crossed the Yangtze River and the nationalist government evacuated Nanjing. Diplomatic communications from U.S. missions recorded the relocation of nationalist administrative offices to Guangzhou, then to Chongqing, and finally to Taipei. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in Beijing. This proclamation was documented in Chinese government records, recorded by international journalists, and reported to foreign ministries worldwide. The PRC became the recognized authority over mainland China, while the Republic of China government maintained its position in Taiwan, controlling the remaining nationalist forces. The Soviet Union recognized the PRC on October 2, 1949. Eastern European states followed shortly after. Western governments did not immediately extend recognition, Diplomatic records show that the United States continued to recognize the Republic of China government on Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government. The issue of China's representation in the United Nations became a recurring subject of General Assembly and Security Council debates throughout the early Cold War. The establishment of the PRC transformed the political landscape of East Asia, shift in regional power. Diplomatic analyses from the U.S., the United Kingdom, and Southeast Asian governments recorded assessments of the new strategic environment, border security, and Soviet-Chinese cooperation. Although detailed agreements were not signed until 1950, Chinese and Soviet delegations conducted documented discussions in late 1949 about economic assistance, military cooperation, and diplomatic coordination. Impact on ongoing conflicts. The Chinese Civil War's conclusion influenced political developments in Korea, Vietnam, and Burma. Reports from U.S. and British embassies documented increased concern about the stability of governments in those regions. These developments extended the Cold War beyond its earlier European framework. By the end of 1949, the global environment reflected several documented structural changes. Two German states had been established. NATO had formed as a Western defense alliance. The Soviet Union possessed atomic weapons. The People's Republic of China had replaced the nationalist government on the mainland. These changes produced a new geopolitical configuration with two major Eurasian powers, the USSR and the PRC, aligned politically, and a Western alliance operating under a collective defense framework. The shift in global power distribution and the expansion of communist governance across East Asia prompted new strategic assessments within the United States, culminating in the drafting of NSC 68 in early 1950. By the late 1940s, espionage cases documented in court proceedings, intelligence memoranda, and declassified communications increased political concern across the Western world. These cases emerged during a period when the Soviet Union had expanded its global presence, exercising political authority in Eastern Europe, establishing formal relations with the newly founded People's Republic of China, and acquiring nuclear capability in 1949. The exposure of espionage networks confirmed that intelligence operations were a significant component of early Cold War competition. Soviet intelligence organizations, the NKVD, later succeeded by the MGB and KGB, had conducted intelligence collection activities throughout the Second World War. Declassified materials, including the Venona decrypts, a joint U.S. U.K. signals intelligence project, show that encrypted Soviet communications were intercepted during the war and partially decrypted beginning in 1946. These decrypts revealed the existence of Soviet espionage networks in several Western countries, though the material remained classified until the mid-1990s. In the period 1946 to 1953, knowledge of these networks was documented only within intelligence agencies. During this time, separate investigations, conducted through public hearings, military tribunals, and criminal courts, revealed individual espionage cases that greatly influenced public perception and political discourse. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who worked on the British and U.S. atomic research programs during the war, became central to early Cold War espionage investigations. Arrest and confession. On February 2, 1950, Fuchs was arrested in the United Kingdom. British Security Service, MI5, interrogation reports, later released, recorded his admission that he had provided classified information to Soviet contacts beginning in 1942. Court proceedings. Fuchs pleaded guilty to charges under the Official Secrets Act. His sentencing on March 1, 1950, 9 years imprisonment, was documented in British court records. Impact on international assessments. Intelligence summaries prepared in both the United Kingdom and the United States in early 1950 linked Fuchs' information transfers to the accelerated development of the Soviet atomic program. These assessments were documented in internal reports, not public announcements at the time. The Fuchs case demonstrated that atomic research during the war had been compromised by espionage, heightening official concerns about internal security. In the United States, the arrest of Julius Rosenberg on July 17, 1950, followed by the arrest of his wife Ethel Rosenberg on August 11, 1950, became one of the most widely documented espionage cases of the early Cold War. Indictments. Grand jury indictments issued in 1950 charged the Rosenbergs with conspiracy to commit espionage under the Espionage Act of 1917. Official court documents detail allegations that the Rosenbergs participated in efforts to transmit atomic information to Soviet contacts. Trial. The trial took place in March 1951. Testimony included statements from David Greenglass and Harry Gold, whose earlier confessions had already been documented in FBI interrogation reports. The court record includes technical descriptions of the alleged information transfers and the structure of the alleged espionage network. Sentencing and appeals. On March 29, 1951, the Rosenbergs were convicted and sentenced to death. Their appeals, documented through extensive legal filings, continued through 1952 to 1953. The executions were carried out on June 19, 1953, at Sing Sing Prison. The Rosenberg case had significant public visibility due to extensive newspaper coverage, but its foundation rested on documented legal proceedings and FBI investigation files. Alger Hiss, a former U.S. State Department official, was not charged with espionage itself, but became a central figure in early Cold War investigations. Accusation. Whittaker Chambers, a former Communist Party member, testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities, WAC, in August 1948, alleging that Hiss had provided classified documents during the 1930s. Congressional transcripts record this testimony. Trials. A grand jury indicted Hiss on charges of perjury related to contradictions between his statements and Chambers' allegations. 2 trials were held, 1949 and early 1950. The second trial resulted in a conviction on January 21, 1950. Sentencing. Hiss was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Court records include evidence presented, including the so-called pumpkin papers, microfilm that Chambers produced, documented in FBI custody records. The Hiss case influenced domestic political discourse in the United States, but its relevance to the broader Cold War lies in its documentation of Soviet-era intelligence penetration earlier in the 20th century. During the same period, Western intelligence services underwent major organizational changes in response to documented espionage cases. The United States created the CIA under the National Security Act of 1947. Operational guidelines, staffing structures, and early directives appear in declassified documents and congressional records. The United Kingdom reorganized MI5 and MI6, expanding counterintelligence units. Canada completed investigations related to the 1945 Gouzenko affair, an earlier case in which Igor Gouzenko, a Soviet cipher clerk, defected and provided documents revealing espionage networks within Canada. These developments were driven by documented evidence, not by speculative assessments of political ideology. Espionage cases coincided with legislative changes in several Western countries. The U.S. Internal Security Act of 1950, McCarran Act, created registration requirements for organizations identified as linked to foreign powers. Congressional debates and recorded votes appear in the congressional record. Executive Order 9835, 1947, established loyalty review boards for U.S. federal employees. Administrative reports from the Civil Service Commission documented the number of cases reviewed. Western European states, including the United Kingdom and France, passed security measures that expanded background checks for government officials. These actions were documented responses to confirmed intelligence breaches. Espionage revelations had implications beyond domestic policy. NATO's internal security procedures were revised in 1951 to 1952, as recorded in alliance planning documents. Diplomatic exchanges between Western governments noted concerns about information sharing protocols. Press coverage documented rising public awareness of espionage cases, though the underlying intelligence assessments remained classified. By early 1950, documented global developments had expanded the Cold War beyond Europe. The Soviet Union had tested an atomic weapon in August 1949, ending the U.S. nuclear monopoly. The People's Republic of China was established in October 1949, altering political conditions in East Asia. Simultaneously, espionage cases, such as those involving Klaus Fuchs and Alger Hiss, had confirmed vulnerabilities in Western security structures. These developments generated a series of internal assessments within the U.S. government, reflected in National Security Council (NSC) records. The most influential of these documents was NSC 68, completed on April 7, 1950. The document, prepared by the State Department's policy planning staff under Paul Nitze, was classified at the time and circulated among senior military and civilian officials. It remained secret until declassification in the 1970s. Its contents are preserved in the U.S. National Archives. The drafting process began in late 1949. President Harry S. Truman requested a comprehensive review of U.S. national security policy following the Soviet atomic test. Memoranda from Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Defense Department officials show that the administration required an integrated assessment of military capabilities, economic resources, and global political trends. Documents produced by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, during this period expressed concerns regarding the U.S. ability to meet potential simultaneous challenges in Europe and Asia. These assessments cited the Soviet Union's documented growing industrial capability, expansion of Soviet-aligned administrative structures in Eastern Europe, the emergence of the People's Republic of China, the potential vulnerability of Western Europe before NATO achieved full military integration. NSC 68 was commissioned to address these concerns. The document consisted of several analytical sections, all based on documented intelligence and economic data available at the time. NSC 68 did not speculate on motives or psychology. Instead, It relied on observable actions, economic reports, and military assessments. Key elements documented in NSC 68 include assessment of U.S. and Soviet capabilities. Using intelligence estimates and industrial output reports, NSC 68 described the relative positions of the United States and the Soviet Union in atomic production, military manpower, and industrial capacity. Review of global political conditions. The document analyzed administrative structures in Eastern Europe, the outcome of the Chinese Civil War, and political developments in Korea, Indochina, and the Middle East using diplomatic reports and regional assessments. Evaluation of existing U.S. policies. NSC 68 examined the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and early NATO planning documents to determine whether existing measures were sufficient to meet documented global developments. Policy recommendations. The document recommended increasing U.S. military readiness, expanding NATO cooperation, strengthening civil defense, and accelerating atomic weapons production. NSC 68 did not propose offensive military action. It called for increased preparedness based on documented capabilities and global conditions. NSC 68 included an economic study prepared from Department of Defense and Treasury Department statistics. These calculations examined the feasibility of significantly increasing defense expenditures while maintaining domestic economic stability. The report concluded, based on quantitative data, that the United States had the industrial capacity to support expanded military commitments without severe economic disruption. These findings were included as technical appendices in the classified version of the report. Throughout April and May 1950, NSC 68 circulated among senior officials. Records from NSC meetings show varied responses. The Joint Chiefs of Staff endorsed the call for greater military readiness. Some State Department officials expressed concern about the long-term budgetary implications. The Treasury Department prepared memoranda analyzing tax and expenditure requirements. Truman did not immediately adopt NSC 68 as formal policy. Instead, the document remained under review while other global developments unfolded. During the drafting of NSC 68, the situation on the Korean Peninsula was monitored closely by U.S. intelligence and diplomatic personnel. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel since August 1945, with separate administrations established in 1948. The Republic of Korea, South Korea, in August 1948. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was established in September 1948. Border incidents were documented throughout 1949 to 1950 in United Nations reports. On June 25, 1950, less than 3 months after NSC 68's completion, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. United Nations Security Council resolutions, beginning on the same day, documented the international response. Because the Soviet delegation was absent from the meeting due to a procedural boycott, the resolutions passed without a veto. The outbreak of the Korean War provided the decisive context in which NSC 68 moved from a policy review to an operational framework. Internal memoranda from July, September 1950 show that Truman and senior officials regarded NSC 68's recommendations as aligned with the requirements created by the new conflict. By the late 1950s, the U.S. government had adopted many of NSC 68's recommendations as documented in Defense Appropriation Acts, increasing the Pentagon budget. Expansion of NATO military planning committees. Acceleration of the Strategic Air Command Modernization Program. Increased atomic weapons production under Atomic Energy Commission directives. NATO records from 1950 to 1951 show that member states began integrating military planning more deeply in response to the same developments identified in NSC 68. NSC 68 influenced diplomatic and military developments in several documented ways. Western Europe. OEC reports and NATO planning documents show increased defense coordination and pressure for rearmament. Asia. U.S. State Department and Pentagon assessments following the Korean conflict documented the need for long-term commitments in Japan, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. United Nations operations. UN records from 1950 onward show greater U.S. advocacy for collective security under Chapter 7 of the Charter. NSC 68 is widely recognized in historical archives as a foundational document for U.S. Cold War strategy. Unlike earlier policies, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, NSC 68 did not address specific regional crises. Instead, it provided a documented global assessment, a long-term strategy for military and economic readiness, a framework for interpreting subsequent international events. By mid-1950, the international system documented in diplomatic correspondence, intelligence assessments, and National Security Council records reflected heightened global tension. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel, established in 1945 as an administrative measure following Japan's surrender, had become a permanent political division by 1948. Two separate governments were documented. The Republic of Korea, ROK, established in Seoul on August 15, 1948. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, established in Pyongyang on September 9, 1948. UN records from 1947 to 1950 documented repeated discussions on Korea's future, but no unified administration emerged. Border incidents were reported throughout 1949 to 1950 by UN observers and military liaison teams. At approximately 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, DPRK forces crossed the 38th parallel in multiple sectors. Reports filed by United Nations Commission on Korea, UNCOC, observers described coordinated military activity, including the use of artillery and armored units. Within hours, the ROK government informed the United Nations of the invasion. The UN Security Council convened the same day. Due to the Soviet delegation's ongoing absence from meetings related to the representation of the People's Republic of China, no veto was exercised. Security Council Resolution 82, June 25, 1950, determined that the DPRK had breached the peace and demanded withdrawal to the 38th parallel. On June 27, 1950, the Security Council adopted Resolution 83, recommending that member states provide assistance to repel the armed attack. Resolution 84, July 7, 1950, established a unified command under the United States. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief for UN forces, as documented in official orders issued from Washington and Tokyo. 16 member states contributed combat forces or medical units, including the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, France, Turkey, Greece, Ethiopia, and others. Additional states provided financial or logistical support. These contributions are recorded in the UN archives. Military reports from the U.S. 8th Army and ROK forces documented rapid DPRK advances. Seoul fell on June 28, 1950. By early August, UN and ROK forces had withdrawn to a defensive perimeter around Pusan. Daily situation reports recorded shortages of manpower, equipment, and ammunition. The arrival of significant U.S. reinforcements in July and August 1950 stabilized the line. Logistics records show a rapid buildup of troops, vehicles, artillery, and supplies through Pusan Harbor. Planning documents from MacArthur's headquarters contain the operational orders for an amphibious landing at Incheon. The landing, executed on September 15, 1950, succeeded in capturing the port and cutting DPRK supply lines. Seoul was retaken on September 28, 1950. UN forces then advanced northward. By early October, they crossed the 38th parallel following the authorization contained in UN General Assembly Resolution 376-V, which called for establishing a unified, independent Korea. Operational reports recorded rapid progress toward the Yalu River. Chinese forces entered the conflict in late October 1950. Chinese military records, released decades later, document the movement of the Chinese People's Volunteers (CPV) across the Yalu River beginning around October 19, 1950. UN intelligence did not initially confirm the scale of the deployment. Engagements at Unsan, 25 to 29 October, provided the first documented large-scale encounters with CPV forces. A major offensive began on November 27, 1950. UN forces withdrew from North Korea under heavy pressure. Reports of the U.S. Corps' evacuation from Hungnam in December 1950 documented a large-scale maritime operation involving the extraction of military personnel and tens of thousands of civilian refugees. Pyongyang was abandoned on December 4, 1950. Seoul was captured again by CPV and DPRK forces on January 4, 1951. By early 1951, UN forces reorganized under General Matthew Ridgway, who assumed command after MacArthur shifted strategic responsibilities. Defensive operations were documented in 8th Army War Diaries, including engagements along the Han River line. A series of counteroffensives in February, March 1951 returned UN troops to the 38th parallel area. Seoul was recaptured on March 14, 1951. Documents from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and Presidential Communications record increasing disagreements between General MacArthur and the Truman administration concerning operational directives and public statements. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command. The official orders cited the need for unified civilian control of military policy, as recorded in U.S. government archives. General Ridgway became Commander-in-Chief of UN forces, and General James Van Fleet took command of the U.S. 8th Army. By mid-1951, the front line stabilized along a fortified series of positions near the 38th parallel. Daily military situation reports recorded limited territorial changes and extensive trench warfare. Casualty records and engineering logs documented the construction of defensive fortifications. Armistice negotiations began on July 10, 1951 at Kaesong. Minutes from negotiation sessions recorded disputes over the position of the ceasefire line, repatriation of prisoners of war, creation of a demilitarized zone. Negotiations paused and resumed several times, with documented interruptions due to military incidents and disagreements over procedural issues. In 1952, the negotiations continued without breakthroughs. Military operations remained limited to patrol clashes, artillery exchanges, and small-scale attacks. Logistic and medical reports documented the effects of prolonged trench warfare. Following renewed diplomatic efforts and documented communications among the United States, China, North Korea, and United Nations representatives, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953 at Panmunjom. The armistice text, preserved in UN and military archives, established a ceasefire, a military demarcation line, a demilitarized zone, DMZ, approximately 4 kilometers wide, mechanisms for prisoner repatriation. No peace treaty was signed. The armistice remains the primary governing document for cessation of hostilities. The Korean War had several documented consequences for global Cold War dynamics. Acceleration of military spending. Defense budgets in the United States and Western Europe increased substantially during 1950 to 1953, as shown in national budget records. Strengthening of NATO. NATO planning documents from 1951 to 1952 show accelerated integration and the establishment of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE. U.S. Japan's security arrangement. The war influenced the signing of the U.S. Japan Security Treaty 1951, documented in State Department archives. Soviet and Chinese coordination. Communications between Moscow and Beijing, recorded in party archives released decades later, show coordinated military and logistical support for the DPRK. By early 1953, the Cold War structure that had developed since the end of the Second World War was documented in diplomatic archives, military reports, alliance treaties, and governmental records across multiple states. The Berlin Blockade, the establishment of NATO, the Soviet acquisition of atomic capability, the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the Korean War had collectively reshaped global power arrangements. The death of Joseph Stalin on March 5, 1953 marked another major historical juncture, documented in official Soviet announcements, medical reports, and cabinet succession records. Documented Soviet government activities from 1951 to 1953 show continued centralization of administrative authority. Politburo minutes and Council of Ministers resolutions from this period recorded decisions concerning industrial output, military expansion, internal security, and foreign policy coordination with Eastern European states. These records indicate ongoing emphasis on heavy industry, energy production, and defense capabilities. During these final years, the Soviet Union also continued regular diplomatic exchanges with the People's Republic of China. Materials from foreign ministry files document discussions over trade, technical assistance, and military coordination. These agreements contributed to structural alignment between the two states following China's establishment in 1949. By the time armistice negotiations advanced in 1953, communications between the Soviet and Chinese leadership, preserved in released party archives, documented coordination on armistice terms. Soviet representatives participated indirectly through diplomatic channels and through liaison mechanisms with DPRK officials. UN records from late 1952 and early 1953 showed gradual progress in prisoner exchange negotiations. Military reports from the UN command and from Chinese and North Korean units recorded a decline in large-scale operations, signaling conditions favorable for concluding a ceasefire. On March 5, 1953, Soviet officials issued a public announcement stating that Joseph Stalin had died following a cerebral hemorrhage. Medical reports published at the time documented the cause and progression of his condition. Government statements, carried in Pravda and broadcast by state radio, confirmed the immediate transfer of authority to a collective leadership composed of Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Vyacheslav Molotov, among others. Soviet administrative records from March, April 1953 document the reorganization of several key ministries, revisions to internal security directives, and changes in leadership responsibilities. These changes marked the beginning of a transition away from Stalin's highly centralized governance structure. Shortly after Stalin's death, armistice negotiations accelerated. Although no single document attributes the shift to a specific decision or instruction, the chronology is clear in the record. By March 1953, renewed communications from DPRK and Chinese representatives indicated readiness to return to stalled negotiation points. In April 1953, the United Nations Command and Communist negotiators reached a documented agreement on prisoner repatriation procedures. On July 27, 1953, the Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The armistice text, preserved in UN and military archives, formalized the cessation of hostilities and established the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. The agreement did not create a peace treaty but provided the framework for military conditions on the peninsula. Records from Eastern European governments show administrative and security adjustments in the months following Stalin's death. These changes were documented in the form of revisions to internal security policies, economic planning directives, leadership transitions within party structures. For example, East German records document increased consultations with the Soviet Union in mid-1953, including economic directives and administrative reorganization in response to unrest in East Berlin in June 1953. The uprising, documented in German police reports, Soviet military logs, and diplomatic communications, resulted in intervention by Soviet armored units and subsequent administrative reforms. These events demonstrated the Soviet Union's continued commitment to control over Eastern Europe even during the leadership transition. In the United States, 1953 brought changes in national leadership with the inauguration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower on January 20th. Eisenhower inherited NSC 68, the ongoing Korean conflict, and NATO operational planning. U.S. government records from early 1953 document the development of the New Look defense concept, though it would not be formally adopted until 1954. NATO records from 1953 continued to show efforts to standardize military equipment, integrate command structures under SHAPE, and coordinate force contributions among member states. The accession of Greece and Turkey to NATO, documented in 1952, further expanded the alliance's geographic perimeter. Simultaneously, Western European integration proceeded through the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEC, documented in annual economic reports reflecting the ongoing implementation of the Marshall Plan. Atomic programs in both superpowers continued to advance. The United States tested its first thermonuclear device on November 1, 1952, at Inuitak Atoll. The Soviet Union conducted its first thermonuclear test on August 12, 1953, at Semipalatinsk. These tests were documented by military reports, scientific publications released later, and intelligence assessments. The successful detonation of thermonuclear devices by both superpowers confirmed a new stage in strategic capability. By the end of 1953, government records across multiple states and international organizations confirmed several structural features of the Cold War system. Two nuclear-armed superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union both possessed atomic and thermonuclear capabilities, as documented in test records. Defined military blocs. NATO, formed in 1949, had expanded and institutionalized defense coordination. Eastern Europe operated under Soviet administrative and military influence. The People's Republic of China is a major geopolitical factor. Diplomatic and military cooperation between China and the Soviet Union had been documented since 1949 and continued through the Korean War. Germany divided. The Federal Republic of Germany, established May 1949, and the German Democratic Republic, established October 1949, represented two distinct political systems, documented by constitutional and administrative records. The armistice in Korea. The ceasefire of July 1953 established long-term military structures that remain in effect. Ideological and security competition institutionalized. Intelligence operations, military treaties, atomic programs, and economic planning documents show that the Cold War was no longer an emerging rivalry, but a defined system. Between 1945 and 1953, documented historical developments transformed the world from the cooperative alliance of the Second World War into a structured, competitive, and militarized international order. Each event, atomic developments, diplomatic realignments, alliance formation, intelligence operations, economic programs, and armed conflict, was recorded in official documents and marked a progressive consolidation of a bipolar global system. By the close of 1953, the Cold War's essential framework had been fully established.